Yeah, so on the second section of today's one, it shouldn't be too long, just 10 minutes or so. I'm going to show you how you can schedule a virtual calculation and write the result back to Node-RED. So this could be used in the diagram below. For example, I've just kept it generic in that you could query any API endpoint that you want. You could use Node-RED to schedule, for example, schedule this daily, and then you could store the result back to Influx. For this exercise, I'm just going to query one of Eigen's API endpoints here, and then I'm just going to write it back to a new Influx tag, and then I'll trend it. But yeah, I'll get going. So within Ingenuity, you have this scripts button on the side. So if I open that into a new tab, that brings up Node-RED, which is running as a part of the product. And within Node-RED, you have the ability to essentially build up scripts, endpoints, or little workflows using the blocks on the left. So here you can see that quite a few of us have started to build out different functions. So this is one that Paul uses, where he queries a temperature monitor in his house and humidity, and then writes the results back to Ingenuity using a simple flow. And throughout the time that we've been using Node-RED, it's been continued to expand, and we've just started developing the Eigen library, which you can see here. For the purpose of this example, I won't use these blocks because I want to show the code that you would need to write that essentially is behind the blocks to give a bit more clarity as to why you do certain things. So let's go ahead. So I'm going to press this plus button on the right to add a new flow. I'm then just going to rename this one. So I'm just going to put training May. And then every time you do something, you can deploy, and it will list some errors or whether it's successful. So you can see here that it's saying that the MQTT broker is undefined. What's probably that is someone's probably playing around on another flow with one of these blocks and they've misconfigured it or something, but it's letting me know, but it's no harm because I can still deploy it. So the first thing I need to do to start a flow is I need to pull an injection block in, and then I will bring a debug block in. So using the Node-RED functionality, you can just drag and drop these mini blocks onto the screen, just like you would in, say, Scratch. And then I can connect the two together. So if I double click on this timestamp, I can see that it essentially, when you press the button here, it sends off a payload, or it sends off a payload within this message object. So you can see here that as default, you have timestamp set. So then if I came to the debug window and I said, okay, I want to debug the complete message object, I can do that. If I redeploy that now and then press play, you can see here that you get this payload that comes through, which has come as part of this. But I could add a new one. So for example, I could change this to, let's just +1. Something like that. I could deploy that. And I'm able to run it, and you can see that the variable, then they can transfer between the different nodes. So when you share variables, they come through this message block. So how would we go about querying an API and then storing it in Influx? So what I can do is I could just drag a couple of blocks across. So one method would be to use the Eigen blocks like so. So you could query a multi-historian endpoint, and then you could write to that endpoint. So that makes it fairly straightforward, but these ones are sort of more for, they're good for the debugging aspect, but in this example, I want to show you how you do it in raw code. So what I'll do is I'll leave these up here because they keep it nice and sort of formatted for myself. So I can drag this function block here, and I can just sort of insert it in the middle. So now if I double click on this function, I can rename it. So what will this be? This will be query data, right? And so in this function block, I can basically write raw JavaScript code, just like you would if you were running it locally. So if I open our documentation, we have an endpoint called multi-request. But for this example, you could actually query any API that's on the web. This one, I just want to use this one because I know how it works pretty well. So essentially, this multi-request API it hits an endpoint. The URL path is historian multi. It's a post request, and the payload consists of a JSON array like so. So you would pass in, for example, the label is the header of your message, and underneath you could then pass in multiple requests. So in this case, it's querying, it's saying, give me the current point for this totalizer here, which is querying our calc historian. So how would I query that in Node-RED? So what I would do is I first need to import any necessary libraries that I want. So I need to define Axios. I need an equals dot get like so. And then I want the process variable as well. So these are global variables that get set like so. So if I put that in like that, let's just put a comment up here. So imports libs. So now if I run that, you can see here that it's still passing through my function block. So one thing I will add that I've got noted here is I need to include this one, this environmental, just to allow me to query self-signed certificates within Node-RED. And the reason I have to do that is due to a library within Ingenuity 7 that allows us to do proxying. So it will occasionally trigger this error on initial request, but by adding this, it will ensure that the flow doesn't fail. So if I bring up the docs for Axios, essentially to run a post request in Axios, all you need to do is run axios.post, pass in your URL, and then pass in your payload. And then if you had any headers you wanted to append to your request, you would just include them like that. So we don't need the latter. We're just going to pass in a URL and a header. So if I create a new section, and the URL I think was in here. Yep, perfect. Like so. So I'm defining my base URI. And now I want to define my payload. So in here, I'll just pinch the example payload that is given in the API docs, and I'll just paste that like so. Just expand my window so I can check for any spacing errors or anything. It looks okay to me. And now I'm going to write my Axios query so I can look in the docs again and remind myself what I need to do. So I can just do const, assign it to a variable, and then I can either use just axios.post or I can append the await in front of it. So if I do const, what should I call it? Get current value equals await Axios, and then I'm going to do URI dot payload like so. Just end my line. So essentially that will query the API. Then I need to get the data. So what I can do is I can do let resp, short for response, equal, and then I keep hitting the minus. I can do get current value dot data. So then if I want to output this, I can go node.warn And then I just want to output my RESP statement. So if I deploy that, we'll see if anything's broken. So if I just clear my debug window. So Axios has failed with code 500. So let's double check what's gone wrong on that. Okay, now. It's probably a typo. So what I've got happening now is that that's querying this API, and this is what the result looks like. So we can see that the endpoint returns results label, data point, timestamp, and value. So you can see here you've got little sub arrays, and you can see here that this is the timestamp and this is the value for this calculation, which is just doing a totalize one. So it's just basically giving me the number of days within a month. And you can see it's the 31st of May today. It's about midday, so it's about 30 and a half. So it's about right. So we've got the data now coming into our debug window, but we need to assign it somewhere. We need to basically add it to our message object. So what we can do is I can define, I'll keep this one here. I can define a few objects. So I can do let value equals, and I can do results. I need to pass in the variable name first. resp.results.label.data point.value. So basically, I'm just following the path here. And then if you were within sort of different subarrays, then you could append arrays, or you could specify individual values within larger arrays by just traversing the JSON path differently. So then if I do let timestamp equal, I can do the same again. This time timestamp. So that looks correct. And then what I can do is I can move my warning message down here. Create log response. And what I can do is just log these. Like so. I'll just comment that one out because I don't necessarily need that right now. So if I clear my pad, you can see here that first warn here is logging my value, and the second is logging my timestamp. So now the question is I have my value and I have a timestamp. I want to now write that back into an influx tag. So what I can do is I can just grab my function code block here and just go Command C and V, copy it, and just drag it back into my flow, rename it, just write data. And I could, if I wanted to, I could just continue writing in the same code block, but in this case, I just want to split it out for example purposes. So I'm going to keep the first section the same. I'm going to come back to my docs, and this time I'm going to find the right API. So it's still a post request, but this is the endpoint, historian write points. I've got an extra slash there. And this time we know that the payload looks a bit different. So I'm just going to copy this example one here. Like so. So here you can see that if I just bring this bit further down and explain this payload a bit more. What this is trying to do is you've been given a points array, and then you can pass in different lists of tag data. So for example, here, this example one is writing to a tag called temperature within the SQLDB historian database. And it's going to write these values. You can see you can pass in a timestamp, a status, and a value, and you could just keep listing values, and you could pass in multiple versions of these. So if I close that off, it's a bit clearer. So then you could send, like, you could write, say, 1,000 points to 1,000 tags within this payload, as an example. So, but in this case, I just want to write one, so I'm just going to clear it. I'm also just touch on this last bit. I want to create the tag. So what this will do is it will first check to see if the tag exists in Influx in our database. And then if not, it will create it for me, which is useful. Otherwise, you'd have to run a previous function above it to do that for you. So the database that we will write to for this example is the demo one that we have. So this is demo InfluxDB. It's a database within our internal Influx. And I'm going to give the tag a name. So I'm just going to call it demo underscore training. And then I'm going to do 2024 as an example. So status, I'll leave OK. The value, I want to pass in those objects. So what I'll do is I'll go message dot value. That's going to retrieve it from the previous function block. And I'm going to go message dot timestamp. So I'm just going to double check that I actually defined those, because I just remembering, I don't think I did. So when I'm running this let timestamp equals, it's defining a variable within this function block, but then adding it, making the message dot value equals is going to add it to this message object on the right that you see that gets appended and then gets accessible as the flow operates. So message dot timestamp, message dot value, that's been defined. So then I can have a look, message dot timestamp, message dot value. So that should create the tag. So now what I need to do is append or check my Axios query. So what I'll change this is I'll just change the variable I'm using to write value, await, Axios URI post payload. So that one looks fine. We don't need to adjust that. We actually don't need to append any of these. We don't need that. So then what we want to probably do is with node.warn, and we'll just output what this write value says. So if I just clear that up, maybe like so, press deploy. So let's test this one out. Yeah, so you can see that it's logged the first two entries, which is at your value of 30 and your timestamp. And so then the third one down is the response from the post request. So you can see it's got status 200. So if I wanted to, I could come down here and I could go if write value dot status, because I can see that status is a top level in the response. I could go equals 200. I could then add like a node.warn. Okay, else what bad, something like that. So for example, if I add like that, so you can see here that it's got okay. So you can put some error handling within your code. And of course, if you're writing Node or Node.js code, you could adjust the Axios request. So for example, you could nest that within a function with a try catch, then meaning that your function won't blow up if it errors midway. It will catch the errors as it goes and log them as needed. So what we've got is it queries the data, it then writes the data, and then we've got our debug node there, just catching the message object at the end. So when this goes to production, I could just disable that one, for example, because I don't need it logging millions of errors. I just need it to only log the errors when it's failed. I don't need it to log all the info status. So how do we schedule it? So within this timestamp block, you can have this, you can say repeat. So what I can do is I can say, I can schedule it to run at a specific time. So for example, I could do midnight, and then that means that this will run at midnight at once a day. But for testing purposes, let's make it run sort of every 15 seconds. Push it to the limit a little bit because it shouldn't be too intensive. So I'll leave it like that so you can see the little squiggle has come there. So I'll just deploy that. Then if I delete this, you should see every time it runs, it should output its debug messaging for us. So just give it a few more seconds to run.
Miles, while we wait, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
What is Axios? What's that in the whole architecture?
Axios is a JavaScript node request library that we use. So it's just like you just sort of install it onto it. So you've got with React, we typically use Axios because it handles the fetch logic for you. Whereas in like Mithril, when we used to run fetch, you had to do like fetch, then like when results come in. Whereas this allows you to run it in it's basically a little package that handles all the smarts for you. But yeah, essentially all it does is you can just define. It's just an API request tool that we use in Node.
Okay.
But you can see now that my script is running. It's writing the value once every 15 seconds. So what I could do is I could come into here, reload it, and I could come along and try and trend my data. So if I set this to be like 10 minutes. Yeah, that works. So then if I add a tag, I can filter by so. There it is. So now if I save that, yeah, you can see here now, I've got my data. It's coming in. So let's try and, if I put it into raw, yeah, you can see here the points being written. So you can see here is when we were testing it. So the gap between the points is a bit higher. And then once it's scheduled, it should start to become consistent. But yeah, so that is, in short, how you would query an API and then write it to an Influx tag within Eigen. In this example, I've gone a little bit more technical approach by showing you how you would do it in raw code. But throughout time, we are building up our library of Node-RED widgets. So for example, the write to historian bit will become a little bit more simple. With this block here, for example, you could just pass in your value by doing message.value and then the timestamp and your tag name to make it a little bit more simple for users, but you'd still need to write a custom function block to query an external API. But then we're working on other blocks to query all the internal APIs from Eigen, as well as sort of building up more top-level node blocks like the time series node, which will include like tag search. So you'd be able to sort of query data a bit like how you would in here. So you could select your historian, you'd have dynamic search. It'd be very similar to the Excel plugin that we've built recently as well. So that allows you to sort of, it takes out you don't need to have the knowledge of the Eigen APIs, but when you click on one of our APIs, we do have all the documentation embedded within them. So you'll be able to use them as needed.
Is this the block we would use to read from Influx?
Yeah.
Okay. This one, cool.
And you can see here that it's doing behind this code block essentially is it's doing exactly what I've done here.
Sure. Yeah. And Miles, what sort of error handling would you suggest for a production deployment? Like, we're gonna set something in production, it needs to work. But if it fails, we need to know. So what sort of strategy you would?
Yeah, so you have these node.warns, so you can apply those where in sort of error catches. So at the moment, node.warn will always appear on your side menu, but you have node.info as well. So if you've written like a production script, you could define like a log level variable at the top. So for example, if you want it debug, then you would it would basically log everything. You can see here right now, you've got node.log, node.warn, node.error. And if you if you escalate your error level to the highest, then when you come into your debug console, you can see it. But you do want to be able to give the users the ability to log everything, because when you're coming to debug a script, if it's not working, you just want to be able to switch it and see. The one thing that you should do is that whenever you write functions is put them into sort of try catch statements. So what that means is if I bring up an example, we can find one in here. Maybe someone's done one. Like this, for example. So you'd have a function and you'd have a try. So then it will go and try your request. And then then you can catch the error. And then what this will do is it won't stop the function. So it means your code will still run through. It just means that you've essentially handled the error. You can then log the error. But yeah, that's sort of in Node-RED, that's all you'd probably need to do, depending on the complexity of a script. But on something like this, where you're just querying one API and writing to the other, you could make the script more efficient by writing it in functions and just appending some try catches, which we do in some of our other ones. So if I bring up like this file uploader here, you can see here this one is written in a try catch format.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, that's all from me. If there are any other questions, then do reach out.